Well, thank you, Mike. So today I'm going to be talking about Getting to We. It's one of the books that we have written based on our research at the University of Tennessee. Now, our research goes very much into how to create and maintain highly collaborative relationships. And most of those relationships that we study are buyer and supplier relationships. So I think that relates to a lot of y'all who are on the phone. And so I'm going to focus most of my examples and energy around buyer and supplier type partnerships, as that is really what makes a lot of the businesses tick.
You kind of gave me three different.
So perfect. So today I'd like to start off with an analogy that business, especially buying and selling of goods and services, is like playing a game. And I'm going to use this analogy that in that game we can play different, it's like playing checkers, right? So we can either play checkers on this game board or we can play chess. Now, I formerly come from a practitioner's point of view and had worked for Microsoft, a very large company, lots of muscle and power in the marketplace. And so when we would go out and work with suppliers, we'd play checkers, right? I'd go out and play checkers. And if I was able to get a lower price, I'd put a checker in my pocket, and that would be great. I would get a bonus for reducing our cost to Microsoft. If I was able to get extension on our payment terms from our suppliers, great. I would get a checker. I would, cash that in. Well, as a supplier, I left Microsoft and joined their largest supplier at the time. And now, as a supplier, I had to outsmart my customer, Microsoft, right? And that's why a lot of suppliers will actually hire their customer, or a customer will hire their suppliers because it kind of gives you some inside information. So now as a service provider to Microsoft, I needed to be smarter than they are. If I was going to protect my margins, if I was going to protect and hold up that price and our revenue that we had budgeted. And so I would play chess. But as I began to become an academic, I began to look at this, how we play the game of buying and selling and negotiating, and it really is just a game. We're really a shell game practically because we aren't transparent. It's often a tit for tat in game theory, if you've ever heard of game theory. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And these relationships go downhill. And it starts early on when we're negotiating. And if you set the wrong tone, you actually set the wrong tone and the economics for that entire deal structure. So let's look at the theory of win-win. Is it possible to have a win-win, right? And you may say, well, I use that term all the time, but when I go to the negotiation table, somehow that spirit always leaves us, right? So I put just a simple game theory matrix here, and I've got you and me. We could put buyer and supplier, right? And so let's say that two parties come to that negotiating table, and they both are dead set that they're going to win at all costs, right? That would be a very muscular approach. Let's think of it as an 800-pound gorilla. Two 800-pound gorillas, they're going to put all they can into it to win. On the other end of the spectrum, you and I come to this negotiation, and we say, gosh, I really want to do what's in your best interest and my best interest. Let's try to seek for a true win-win. You would have a highly cooperative game. That's actually considered a win-win or a non-zero-sum game in game theory. But most of the time, what happens is we fall somewhere in between. We win some, we lose some. We win some, we lose some. We command and we cooperate back and forth and back and forth. We give and take in those negotiations. And then every day in our relationship as a buyer and supplier, we're giving and taking. But that necessarily isn't healthy. And why isn't it healthy? Because when I am not consistent in how I work, it actually sends mixed signals and causes distrust with your partner, with your business partner. Well, you said this, or you were going in this direction and you changed your direction. So it takes away from trust, and that actually leads to cost. And a professor by the name of Oliver Williamson has studied these costs of transactions. It's actually a science called transaction cost economics. And he shows that when we use a muscular approach or we are playing tit for tat, we tend to have much higher costs associated with the cost of doing business. So why do we fall short, right? Why is it that we fall short? Well, there's different philosophies. On one end of the spectrum, we can start with no. This is a very, very popular negotiation book, Start with No. America's #1 negotiating coach explains why win-win is ineffective, right? And he says you just need to start with no, because if you say no enough, the other party's going to cave. And on the other end of that spectrum is our work, which is really striving for these highly collaborative win-win relationships. And we call that getting to we. But somewhere in the middle there, right, somewhere in the middle is more along the lines of what we would think of as getting to yes, and I'll get that in a minute. So let's look at and diagnose what happens when we start with no. It's kind of like playing tug of war, right? Each party, the buyer and the supplier, are on each side of that rope, and they're going to tug, and they're going to tug, and they're going to tug, and they're going to tug. So we spend a lot of energy and cost associated with that negotiation when we do that. Now, then we have getting to yes, right? So very, very popular book, Getting to Yes, Negotiating Agreements Without Giving In. So here what happens is we take they're really stressing on taking the tension out of that relationship. Let's negotiate, let's get to agreement, but I really don't want to give in, but I'm going to do whatever I can in my best interest to get to a deal that is good for me. So it's still about the art of getting to a good deal, but without caving. So he says in this book, you should focus on principles and not the people. They also use an analogy of an orange. Right? So in Fisher and Urey's book, they have an orange, and they say a win-win is when you have an orange, and let's say we both want the orange. Well, my job as a negotiator is to talk to the other person and say, why do you want that orange? Oh, well, I didn't realize you were going to bake a cake. So how about you just take the outside of the orange and I'll take the inside, because I'm not going to bake a cake. I don't need that for cooking. I want to eat the orange. So we find creative ways to allocate this orange, right? But think about the flaw in that logic. Don't we still have one orange? So while we're dividing the orange up, we still have one orange. So yes, we get to a fair and balanced negotiation, but it's really not taking us to a new level. So this is where the philosophy of getting to we comes in, because in getting to we, what we want to do is lay the foundation for that relationship and negotiate an agreement where we are not focusing on one orange and creatively splitting it, but instead we are trying to plant the seeds for a relationship that will grow an entire orange tree. Maybe we could partner together, and you could supply the capital and I could supply the resources, the time and energy, and together we could grow this tree. So is it possible in a highly collaborative relationship to really drive innovation, to invest in the partnership, to create value? So when you look at buying and supplying, buyers and suppliers, we can choose to play a value exchange game. I give you $1, you give me a unit of service, right? Or a value creation game. How can we actually create value beyond what we have today? Either through more market share, a lower cost structure. Notice I didn't say lower price. I'm not attacking your price. I'm saying how can we reduce our cost structure? And when we do, why don't we take that savings and you'll get some and I get some, right? What about quality, food safety, right? So will that increase our ability to actually create value? So I ask you to sit down and ask yourself, what game are you playing when you go to the negotiation table? Are you starting with no? Are you playing this endless tug-of-war? Are you getting to yes? Or are you really getting to we and laying the foundation for these highly collaborative relationships that create value? So having said that, let's march forward and look at the steps it takes for you to lay these foundations. Now there are 5 steps in the Getting to We process, and we outline these in great detail in the book, Getting to We. Step 1 is to ask yourself, are you ready? And to do that, you have to think about 3 dimensions: compatibility, trust, and transparency. So when you think about someone you don't trust, the used car dealer often pops to mind. can you really have a fair negotiation with this guy? Right? So what do you want to do? You want to seek to have trust, transparency, and compatibility. So you might be asking yourself, well, Kate, that's great. I'd love to have a trusting partnership with my supplier or with my client, with my customer, but we don't have one. So what's your recommendations? You have to start somewhere and focus on building trust, earning trust, and having that discussion. We find that simply having a discussion and laying down your intent that you would like to build more trust in the relationship. How could we build more trust in that relationship? How could we be more compatible in our processes so that our teams work more effectively together? So you want to begin to have a discussion around these components. Because if you're not talking about these components, how can you actually achieve them without knowing what your partner feels about transparency, what your partner feels is a trusting relationship? So begin to have the dialogue. And yes, trust matters, right? I love this book by Stephen Covey, The Speed of Trust. It really goes into a great detail about why trust is so important. And he has this quote. He says, above all, success in business requires two things: a winning competitive strategy and superb organizational execution. Distrust is the enemy of both. I submit that while high trust won't necessarily rescue a poor strategy, low trust will almost always derail a good one. So if you sense you don't have a highly trusting relationship, step back in that relationship and begin to ask your business partner, how can you purposely work together to build trust? So Covey in his book outlines 7 taxes of not having trust. And these are probably very real to you. I imagine every one of you can think of a relationship that doesn't have the level of trust you want and how that causes you to have rework, redundancy, right? Unnecessary duplication. If a buyer doesn't trust a supplier, what do? They micromanage them. They begin to put someone on the site to breathe down their neck. What about the bureaucracy? You know, going back and forth on signing off on something. Well, I can't really do that. Let me send it up the curve. You've been to negotiations where they have the good cop, bad cop, right? What about politics, right? When you try to use your power to gain strategy. At Microsoft, that's exactly one of the strategies that I used. We were a big, huge company. We could get away with throwing our power around. Very muscular approach when I went to the negotiation table. What about turnover? The best people and suppliers don't want to work for an organization where they're not being trusted, their client isn't trusting. So what happens is those A-team players will go work on another client. So if I'm a buyer and I want to have a supplier that brings the A-team, you need to have a good trusting relationship, because if you don't, they're going to leave and go to the other client that's going to treat them well. You know, of course, there's flat-out dishonesty and fraud too. If we don't trust someone as well, you know, and that's a big reason why you don't trust. But most companies don't start off and say, I'm going to be fraudulent. Instead, what happens is they build a relationship that for various reasons just doesn't trust each other, and these taxes actually come into play in that relationship. So how can you get started with the dialogue? I'm going to use a couple of case studies here. The one I'm going to pick is from Dell and Genco. And their case study is actually featured in our book, Vested Outsourcing, 5 Rules That Will Transform Outsourcing. So this is Tom Perry, President of Reverse Logistics for Genco. So to set the stage, Dell and Genco had been working together for about 8 years. They'd gone through a competitive bid, and every single time Genco would win the work. Dell has a policy, every dollar, every year. So Genco, capability-wise, was an excellent supplier. But there was just something wrong with that relationship. It had a lot of tension. It had a lot of those taxes that Covey talked about, right? So they decided to sit down and have a 2-day strategic offsite. So Genco and Dell's executives got together in a neutral site. They said, I'm not going to do this in Austin, Texas at Dell's headquarters, and we're not going to do this in Genco's facility. We want the people to be in a different location, off-site, where we can focus and be away from the day-to-day business and have a candid and truthful conversation about trust and how to rebuild trust that was lost. And Tom Perry says there was a moment of truth in that June meeting. If you can't get past the absence of trust, you can't ever make it work. So what was causing the distrust in the relationship? How could they eliminate those distrustful actions and begin to inject trusting actions? If you don't ask yourself what is distrusting and what is trustful actions, you won't ever know the answer. So let's look at another organization, Sykes. And this case study is actually featured in our book, Getting to We. Now, for those who don't know Sykes, they're a service provider. They do call center. So if you're a company and you need your phones answered, your orders taken, customer service, they are a customer service agency firm. So Jim Hobby was the Executive Vice President of Global Operations. He's recently retired. But in our case study, he shared this wonderful quote, and it was around sharing financial information and being transparent. Sykes did not feel that it was in their best interest to be transparent with their financial information, because their customer, every time they were transparent, their client would come back and just take money off the table. Wow, that's interesting. You've got cost here. I think we should reduce it. And the customer was using that information and their power against Sykes. So Sykes had a policy that they would use firm fixed price deals, and they would not share transparently their cost structure or margin. And the customer that they had at this time was really seeking for transparency, and it was really against Jim Hobby's principles to do this. And he stepped back and he said, and he said, all right, so let's rethink this. Why are you using this information? How is it going to benefit our relationship? And he asked them, he said, if I share this information, how will you not use it so it comes back and is against me and takes money out of my pocket? And he said sharing the financial information brought business logic to the conversation. It was a breakthrough point for all of us. Our client realized that Sykes was being honest with him. Openness made our conversation business discussions, and the conversations were more rational. So transparency has a way of shining light on the truth, and it makes us trust each other more, because now we can see the information. We can see that. The customer in this case realized that Sykes was being honest with them with regards to why their prices were the way they were, right? They couldn't lower their price because their cost structures were at a certain level. So step 2, once you establish that you've got enough trust and transparency and you have someone on the other end that you actually like, you're compatible with, those are the partners that you want to go deeper on, right? So let's say, P&G, for example, has 80,000 suppliers. They can't have all of their suppliers be equal. So which ones do they want to choose to develop more strategic relations with? So once you've got past and answered that question, which suppliers or customers do I trust, can be transparent with, and actually like to do business with? Step 2 becomes defining your shared vision. And this is where you need to get alignment on where you're going. All too often, a buyer and a supplier don't have alignment. And we see this over and over again when we go in and we do workshops with buyer and supplier teams. The buyer will say they're going down one path, but oftentimes procurement is going down one path and the business unit's going down another path. The businesses are not aligned, and then the supplier is not aligned with that. So we encourage you to, in these strategic offsites, really think about a shared vision. And I use an analogy here. You go into Mount Everest or you go into the moon, right? So where are you going? Write it down and begin to think about the strategic objectives that you need to accomplish to get there. It's not just the buyer's vision and the buyer's objectives. It needs to be the buyer and the supplier, because the supplier is kind of like a Sherpa, right? So if you're climbing Mount Everest, you can't get there without a Sherpa. That would be your business partner, your supplier. So we need to get there together. So we need to have this shared vision and alignment on the objectives of what we're trying to do. So that shared vision is very, very important. So once we have that shared vision and we're all clear where we're going, step 3 becomes clearly stating and agreeing on your intentions. Now, it's interesting because we actually like to see your stated intentions in your contract itself. And a lot of people go, especially lawyers, would say, why would I want to put my intentions in my contract? Things change. right? That could come back and haunt me. Well, that's exactly why you want to put your intentions in there, is because things do change, and when you need to make decisions, you want to come back to a set of guiding principles that are fair and balanced, and that you use behaviors that promote collaborative relationships instead of this tug-of-war type principles. So we recommend you ask yourself and create statements around 6 guiding principles. And these guiding principles, we don't just put some bullets on a page there. They're actually based on social and economic research. Reciprocity, right? So if you do something, if you invest in the relationship, how am I going to invest in the relationship? Are we going to be honest? Of course, that's a great one, right? Equity. When we win together, how are we going to share that pie? If we are indeed creating value, what are the principles that we will use to share the pie? Will we be loyal to each other? When will it be okay not to support this relationship versus having a commitment to the relationship? So we ask people to think about these principles and the behaviors that will drive their relationship, and to actually write them down. So write these down. And I know that seems a little hokey because you've probably never seen that in a contract, but it is quite powerful. So this is an example of what a statement of intent looks like, and it's actually just a schedule in your contract. It says that the company and the supplier enter into this agreement with the intentions to follow these guiding principles and these behaviors. Think about the power of this, right? Because now when you're in the heat of negotiation, you can come back and say, gosh, remember we had really talked about that we were going to be very honest in our discussions. Let me give you some critical feedback, or let's be transparent in our financials because we can't get to the total cost of ownership without that. So the statement of intent is a wonderful way to lay the foundation for a very good relationship. Now let's move on to step 4. This is where we begin to negotiate as we, right? So we're not just in the initial negotiation, but every day in our relationship is a negotiation about something, even though it might be minor. Well, I point to another book here called, it's Chester Kress, and it's The Negotiating Game. And on his website, not necessarily for his book, but on his website, there's a wonderful glossary of negotiation terms. And what I find fascinating is that so many of these terms are very, very destructive tactics. Good cop, bad cop, right? You can go on and on, bluffing, the 4 corner stalls. It's just amazing how many of these tactics are really trust-busting tactics. And so we always encourage organizations before they enter into the physical negotiation of what they're doing to go through this list of the glossary and just with a highlighter, do a red line and red line out the tactics that are not acceptable in your negotiation or that are acceptable. So it's very clear that you're negotiating with the same principles and philosophies and purposely using trust-building tactics in that negotiation. So what are some of these trust-building tactics? We call them what's in it for we tactics instead of what's in it for me tactics. Transparency, right? Information is power. So if we both have the same information, now we can make better decisions. If I'm not sharing information, I may be making a decision or asking for a request in that negotiation because I don't have the complete information. Another thing that we recommend is to reveal your alternative. When's the last time someone actually told you to, don't ever share your BATNA, your best alternative to no negotiated agreement? We actually recommend you put your walkaway up front. I can't do a deal unless I have this at a minimum. This is my BATNA. So if we can't get to a deal that meets my BATNA, then I need to walk away. So think about the power if both of you put your BATNA down. Now you have this whole playground for negotiation. But unfortunately, what you see is people hold their BATNA and they spend all this time and energy going back and forth. Now, when we encourage pie expansion or planting that orange tree, we want to encourage people to think about shared risk and shared reward. So just because you put your BATNA down, if you take on a risk, you should get a reward for that, right? Shared risk, shared reward. So start with your BATNA and say, where's the risk I'm going to be able to take in my BATNA? This is the risk I can hold, but what is the reward I'm going to get for that in exchange? Again, I'm talking about shared vision and shared agenda, seeking for alignment, right? Really getting that money, getting that alignment. And the last one, quite controversial, I think, amongst many negotiators. But a traditional tactic is tit for tat, right? You go back and forth, and concessions and trade-offs, and concessions and trade-offs, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And Dr. Oliver Williamson won a Nobel Prize in 2009. Now, Williamson is an economics professor at the University of California, Berkeley, and he studies the art and science of transaction cost economics. And one of his wonderful pieces of advice is leave money on the table. And as a negotiator, you might be sitting here going, I can't believe you're actually saying that. And someone won a Nobel Prize with that statement, really? And here's why. When we actually leave something on the table, it is a trust-building move. The other party will leave something on the table. So now you're actually building that relationship. I'll invest in this relationship. Well, so will I. I'll do this. Well, so will I. Instead of taking away in a tit for tat, you're actually creating value by investing in that relationship, right? And if you are being transparent, you can understand the true cost structures and begin to work together to reduce the cost structure, not just beat up on the price. Now the last step is step 5, which is living as we. And as I like to say, business happens. We need to be very flexible. So go back to our shared vision. What if our shared vision was to climb Mount Everest? Well, you don't necessarily get there going straight up. Actually, I don't think anyone has. You have a path, and you're going to look at the dangers and perils in your path, or just the day-to-day business things that come up, and you're going to make real-time adjustments. So in your relationship, you have to be flexible because you don't know what's going to happen. And you have to be able to embrace those changes on a day-to-day basis together. Now in a traditional contract, the supplier would go, not in the contract, scope creep, give me some more money. Can't do that, not in the contract, right? But if we were truly operating from a transparent cost basis, could we actually say, wow, wasn't expecting that. Gosh, I hate it when this cost happens. How can we together mitigate these costs? Or how can we together mitigate these risks? We often forget that mitigating risks is a way to save money as much as fighting over them, right? So how can we create flexibility in that agreement so that we are very dynamic and embrace change, because change is real. Business happens. How do we embrace it with a good attitude in a fair and flexible manner? So I want to turn to another case study here, and this is from P&G, Procter & Gamble, and Jones Lang LaSalle. And this case study was also a public case study, so you can read about it as well. So what about the P&G case study? When P&G chose to outsource their facilities and real estate management to Jones Lang LaSalle, William Reeves was the head of real estate and facilities management at the time. And he really chose a path to build a purpose-trusting relationship, a long-term strategic relationship with Jones Lang LaSalle. And I remember when in the story when they were telling me this, William Reeves turned to the head of JLM and said, you know what, we've never done this. And they had some big lofty goals on what they were trying to do. We've never done this, and neither have you. But we have the best chance to get there with you. And we're willing to climb Mount Everest if you are. And so that meant as they began that journey to Mount Everest to achieve their desired outcomes and innovate in the area of facilities and real estate management, William Reeves had to really not micromanage Jones Lang LaSalle, to set the tone very different. And he says, I share with Bill, that was his counterpart, our business plans, what we need to achieve, what my objectives are as an organization, and set expectations for the organization. We do joint leadership team meetings to discuss where we are from a business standpoint, what's working well, what's not working well. And it's important for our customers which is internal employees at P&G, right? They are the people who come to the buildings every day, for JLL's organization and our governance organization to see Bill and I together and to see that we are aligned and have common objectives. So every time something would come up, they would make a point to say, yes, we're aligned. We are aligned. What's the answer to this? I don't know, Bill. What is the answer to that? They had to have the same answer because it set a tone of consistency and that they were aligned as they climbed their own Mount Everest. So here's some tricks to help you live as we. And these are real tricks that we've seen. Put the elephant in the room. How many times have you sat there and had, the little Dilbert cartoon running through your head, or go, oh my God, I can't believe we didn't discuss this, or missing the boat? Put the elephant in the room. It's shocking when you do that the elephant often disappears or is not nearly as big as it is. But yet we spend all this time and energy walking around the elephant, and why are we ignoring it? We find that that is a wonderful trick to really help companies. And we actually say, if you're having trouble bringing up the topic, actually start with that. Say, gosh, I'd like to put an elephant in the room. Somehow that diffuses it. Now this next example is Angry Birds. This was from a bank and one of their strategic service providers. They put Angry Birds in all the conference rooms. And so when they wanted to put something in the room, if they weren't being as candid as they could, if they weren't being, putting those elephants in the room, they said, hey, I need to give you the bird, right? You're not living into our intentions. Wasn't our intention X? We need to live into our intention. I'm going to give you the bird. And it was a lighthearted way that they could begin to talk about things that they normally wouldn't talk about in those relationships. So I want to wrap up with just a couple of case studies showing that the philosophies and this power of a vested mindset is quite powerful. So I'm going to use two case studies, one from a big company that y'all all know and one from a small company, because this is small and medium-sized businesses that I'm sure you've never heard of. But you can see that the concept does work, big or small. The first one I want to share is McDonald's. And y'all are all familiar with McDonald's being in IFMA. And Ray Kroc founded McDonald's on the philosophy that none of us is as good as all of us. And he used the three-legged stool analogy, right? So the buyer, so McDonald's is a corporation, the suppliers, and the franchise owner-operators would each have a seat at the table. And so big decisions would be made giving everyone's input. They would have a shared vision, the same desired outcomes. They actually call them a plan to win. So if everyone was aligned to the plan to win, think about the synergy that they could get. And it says, this is a note from a supplier, everyone understands they're trying to create wealth for all three legs of the stool. As we grow the pie, there's more for all. So again, that concept of planting the orange tree, grow the pie, right? So how can we grow the pie? When we grow the pie, we will win. And if you look at the history of McDonald's, a lot of the suppliers that they started with were small suppliers, small privately held companies that grew with McDonald's because they were innovative. They invested in McDonald's, McDonald's invested in them, right? And McDonald's has proven that these relationships where you invest in that relationship jointly around innovation helps really drive a lot of value. So what's one way that they create value? USA Today, McDonald's is far more rigorous at checking bacteria and dangerous pathogens. The FDA standards, they check their beef 5 to 10 times more than the FDA standards in the U.S. 68 million people served every day. They haven't had an E. coli instance since 1986. Now, I know they're going through some issues with one of their suppliers now, and quite interesting to see how they have worked with that supplier, and this other suppliers are rising to the occasion to help assured supply. But partnerships do matter, right? Partnerships do matter. It's kept them out of the news until now on food safety and quality, but you know what? That supplier also dealt with other companies as well. Let's look at sustainability, right? McDonald's and their suppliers were able to achieve 100% certified sustainable fish. That's an amazing feat. The Marine Stewardship Council's certification, a wonderful video on their website talking about how McDonald's and their suppliers work together around sustainability issues. And, who ran out of chicken during the avian flu crisis? McDonald's didn't. Suppliers were able to figure out creative ways to get chicken into the Asian market when the Asian suppliers could not. So suppliers can absolutely, time and time again, prove that they can create value for McDonald's. And McDonald's in return commits to the suppliers by having long-term strategic relationships. Some of those relationships, many dating back to the 50s, 30, 40, 50-year-old relationships. In the last 5 years, they've only exited 5 suppliers, right? So they choose not to have a strategic or a highly competitive bid situation. They choose to work strategically with suppliers in a committed, what's in it for we type of a relationship. Again, Ray Kroc, none of us as good as all of us. So I want to leave with a case study from a company that you've probably never heard of. They're a $7.5 million contract manufacturer in Oregon. And you can imagine that in Oregon, if you're a contract manufacturer, your labor costs are quite high. Your real estate is quite high. And so you're competing with Chinese manufacturers, right? And so all of these companies are going over to China. They can obviously get their stuff manufactured cheaper in China. This is just a little supplier, special high-end tooling and little stuff, right? And so their CEO, someone had given the CEO of that company my book, and he called me up and he said, Kate, I really see that you've got a lot of big company examples, McDonald's, Microsoft. I like the philosophy, but I don't know how it'll work for me. And I challenged him. I said, come to my class. Come to my class at the University of Tennessee. Spend 3 days, and let's see what we can take away so that you can begin to apply as much as you can. I mean, what if you only have one thing you take away and it improves your business? And he goes, that's a good point. So Scott Schroeder's his name, the CEO. He invested in coming to our class, our executive education class in Knoxville. And so he said, what can I take back? And so he knew that he couldn't apply all of the vested. There's actually, when you think about the term vested, and this is what I did the keynote on at the IFMA conference, we actually teach people how to embed these concepts in their contracts. And he said, Kate, I can't get my big customers to put some of this stuff in their contract. But what I can do is change my behavior, and I can be looking out for my customers' behaviors. And I can begin to take my customers and choose purposely to invest in those customers that do want to build a trusting relationship, that do value my transparency. If I'm the CEO and I'm going to lay it out there on the table and be transparent, who's not going to come over and use that against me? So he began to look at the behaviors of his clients and his behaviors. And he says, I'm going to lead these relationships by setting this different tone in these relationships. So let's go have a CEO to the client relationship discussion and say, how can we build more trust? And he did that. And so he actually had one customer that he felt was one of their better customers, and they were coming up with a bid. And he would normally be parts of these highly competitive bids. And so he began to nurture this. He goes, I know you've got this new thing coming up, but I think we could work together in a more transparent way, and I could actually reduce your cost structure, improve your cycle time. And so he actually preempted that and was able to take that customer, which was a nice little customer for them, and actually increase that customer size by about 10x. And normally it takes them much longer through a competitive process. And he said, you know what, I'm going to go in and I'm going to have a different discussion. And I'm going to say, here's transparently, here's how I could solve your problem, and here's the cost structure. And if you can go to China and it's cheaper, great. But I'm looking at total cost of ownership, not the cost of the good itself. And look at all these other areas. So when he looked across his entire customer base, he said that he was able to really reduce the cycle time with these customers because he had purposely tried to build trust. Right? So it was taking him less time, and he was getting more revenue from these clients. So segmenting your clients if you're a supplier, or likewise if you're a buyer, right? If you're segmenting your suppliers. McDonald's says, can't have all their suppliers have a seat at the table like their main important ones. They say they have mops and broom suppliers, and then they have their strategic vested relationship. So that's a little bit about the concept of vested. I've just taken a little part about it, but mostly what I focused on is getting to we and 5 steps that anyone could take, small or big, that you can do to inject trust into your relationship and begin to lay a good foundation for some of your existing relationships or new relationships. So with that, I'm going to open it up to questions. So I'm going to turn it over to
the conference has been unmuted.
Perfect. So any questions from out there? And also we have a chat button. So please feel free to enter into the chat button if you have any questions online. Great. Well, good. I see one question coming in on chat already to me. And it said, Kate, what are some of the tactics that Scott used to introduce the concept to his customer? And I think that's a great discussion. He actually went out to dinner. So he tells a story in the book. It's a great story. And so he went out to dinner with one of his clients. And he said he has this, one of his screening for when he's looking at clients, especially new clients, but he was originally doing this with his existing clients, is he said, would I take them home to meet my family? Would I have this business discussion in front of my family? And he said he looked for consistencies in behavior. And he said, I'm going to vow to have consistency in my behavior. I'm going to state my intentions. I'm going to say, gosh, my intentions out of this deal to be fair to you, client, or to increase my revenue and profitability. I'm not going to lie to you. Here's how I want to do it, right? And so he said he began putting his intentions on the table, and he would see that if the customer sitting across from him would do something similar. And he said, because again, it's like tit for tat, but it's creating a positive tit for tat. I'm going to reveal something if you reveal something. I'm going to tell you something that we normally wouldn't share as a supplier if you tell me something, right? If I'm going to be transparent, will you be transparent? And so he then could see where those relationships would go. And he said that he knew those were the relationships that he wanted to foster and that he as a CEO would invest in. Excellent. Any questions on the phone coming in? We can always take chat questions as well, but any questions on the phone? All right, don't be shy. I can take another chat question if you'd like, but I'll give you another opportunity for those who are on the phone.
I've got a quick question. Most of this obviously is coming to us as manufacturers in the food industry, as we are the sellers and the buyers. What happens when you have another relationship where you are actually the buyer, such as using a secondary supplier, and you're having some challenges establishing the trust factor with that supplier? I mean, how do you get to we without throwing your best alternative and saying you have to come my way or we're going to go elsewhere?
Yeah, I like what Dell did. I mean, that was really Dell's situation, right? And I think so many companies are in this situation where they have, I'll call it P&G calls it a green score, red face, right? They have a supplier and they might be having okay performance, but it just isn't working, right? The relationship isn't working. And I would say if you have a red scorecard, like if the supplier is doing terribly, switch suppliers. That's a different question, right? So first, you have a capable supplier and a bad relationship, or a relationship that's not as positive as you'd like, right? If you got a bad supplier, you got to deal with that. I'm not going to tell you how you deal with that. But if you've got a good supplier and you're not having the trust or the transparency and you just fall into those relationship taxes that Covey talks about, I like what Dell did, is they just put the elephant in the room and said, you know what? We go to bid every year and you always win. And you always frustrate us. And I'm sure we frustrate you. Do we frustrate you? How do we frustrate you? And so that opened the door for the supplier to go, you piss us off all the time. And so they said, well, let's go talk about it, because if we're doing things to piss you off and we're doing things that frustrate you, let's have an offsite. And they purposely chose a city. They went to Dallas, Texas at the Texas Motor Speedway, and they said, let's go offsite, bring the people there that can drive the change, right? And they brought the right people in the room, and they said, look, the tone of this relationship is set by our behavior. And we can choose to walk out of this room in 2 days with a different set of behaviors, or we can say to continue the way we are. And you know what? Then Dell's going to go to bed, and you're probably going to win, and we're going to be frustrated. But at some point, we can't do that anymore. You will frustrate us so much we don't want to work with you. It's that compatibility thing. And so they really just put the elephant in the room and began to discuss what behaviors were working, what behaviors weren't working. And they wrote them down. They wrote down their intentions. They created that shared vision. And it really, from that day forward, they walked out of the room and they said, I commit to change my behaviors. Now, because they wrote down what behaviors were good, remember the statement of intention? Because they wrote that down, now they could come back and hold each other accountable. They didn't have angry birds, but if they did, they'd have said, hey, Tom Perry, I'm giving you the birds. You said this was the behavior you wanted to do, and you've just done something different. And so they weren't afraid to call themselves on each other's behaviors early on to reset the tone. So I hope that gives you some insight. Scott just approaching a customer. Here he was a supplier saying, I want to have a different deal. If you're willing, I want to have a different conversation. This is not a sales pitch, right? So, and I think buyers, if a buyer leads the discussion, it is more powerful than a supplier does, but it can be started by either party. So that's a fantastic question. Any other questions?
I think we have time for one more. Anybody else?
All right, one more, and then I'm going to go to a chat question. One more opportunity before I go to chat. All right. So the question that we had on chat was around the statement of intent. I had mentioned that we actually recommend putting that into a contract. And the question is, how would you actually do that, right? And so, a lot of times lawyers don't want to see that in the contract. So sometimes we make it an addendum to the contract. Sometimes it's just something that you physically just write down, right? You can put it in what if you wrote down those bullet points? We had one company. Actually, it's a catering company, does catering and cafeteria management for organizations. And they wrote those little statement of intent behaviors, right? They were those behaviors. They actually put them on really big, oversized poster board and just put them in all the conference rooms. So when they had meetings, it would reinforce the fact that these were the stated positive behaviors that they wanted to drive in the meetings. And so we like seeing it in a contract, but if you can't put it in a contract, at least write it down. Meet with your partner, write it down, begin brainwashing and propaganda. Stick it in the conference room. Put the little angry birds around, right? Make it a fun way that you can purposely begin to drive a different discussion and a different culture, that positive tit for tat versus that negative tit for tat.
Great. Well, Kate, thank you so much for joining us and really for this enlightening presentation. I think it's very relevant for everything that's happening in food service right now, and especially those who have participated in small, mid-sized business calls in the past and have been at any IFMA conferences. You might be familiar with our operator-manufacturer collaboration model, which a lot of what Kate discussed today about getting to we and how taking the emotion out of the room and having these honest conversations with each other is really, really important. And so actually, we'll be having a breakout on the operator-manufacturer collaboration model at our President's Conference coming up here on November 2nd to 4th in Arizona. So If you want to learn more about that specific model, about how manufacturers and operators are working together, highly encourage you to join. But again, Kate, thank you so much. This has been great. And as far as other notes are concerned for the small mid-sized business community, look out for some communication over the next week or two regarding next month's call. As I mentioned, President's Conference is on November 2nd to 4th, and hope to see you there. In addition, we have our category management training session next week on September 23rd here in the Chicago area. If you haven't signed up, it's not too late to do so. We also have one coming up on November 12th as well if you're interested. And also food service fundamentals in October 23rd. Anybody who's new to food service or just wants refreshing on what's happening in food service and the new view of the consumer landscape, please let me know if you have any questions. Again, this is Mike Schwartz from IFMA. My email is mike@ifmaworld.com. And also you can visit our website at www.ifmaworld.com. But again, thank you very much. Kate, appreciate it, and talk with you all soon.
Excellent, excellent. I'll leave you guys with one challenge, like I challenged Scott Schroeder when he called me 3 years ago or so. You know, come to our class and learn more. And he's done amazing things with his business. He's got a YouTube video out on it actually as well, talking about the power of how he thinks differently with his clients now and how it's paid off for him. So I challenge y'all to learn as much as you can, read the book, and if you have any questions, reach out to me. So thank you so much for having me.
Great. Thank you. Take care.